Hi, everyone. Tonight we're going to start with something that might feel cozy at first. Picture cinnamon in the air, kids tearing into wrapping paper, and laughter bouncing around a warm house. But you probably won't survive the way this story twists. What looked like an ordinary Christmas morning turned into the most unforgettable clash of my life. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The memory begins with Amanda's voice, slicing through that warmth like a blade. "You're such a useless old woman." I can still hear it echoing across the dinner table, cold enough to stop the clinking of silverware. My cheeks flushed, but I stood up slowly, refusing to cower. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Then stop calling me when you need money." That sentence, those 9 little words, felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. What she did next forced me to dial 911 within minutes, but we'll get there. For now, let me back up and explain how Christmas morning slid from joyful to catastrophic. I'm Margaret Foster, though everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 67 years old, and I thought I'd seen every flavor of family drama. Turns out, I'd only been tasting appetizers compared to the main course that was about to be served. That morning actually started like a Hallmark card. My son Brian had invited me to spend the holiday with his family, a rarity these days. His wife Amanda usually preferred smaller gatherings, which was code for keep Maggie at arm's length. But this year, she'd surprised me with warmth in her voice, even enthusiasm. Looking back, I should have heard the trapdoor creak open beneath my feet. I arrived at their suburban Denver home at exactly 10 a.m., punctual as always, carrying my famous apple crisp and a neat bag of gifts. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, like the ghosts of holidays past. The sound of Bing Crosby drifted through the living room, layered with the rustling of wrapping paper. Emma, my 14-year-old granddaughter, squealed, "Grandma Maggie," and rushed into my arms with a hug so genuine it could have melted glaciers. Jake, 16, tried hard to look cool, but betrayed himself with a crooked smile and an offer to carry my heavy bag. Then came Amanda, wearing her polished hostess smile, the kind that deserves an Oscar nomination. "Margaret, so glad you could make it. The kids have been asking for you all morning." Her voice had sugar sprinkled on it, but the aftertaste was bitter. Brian hugged me warmly, and for a few fleeting hours, everything seemed perfect. Presents were opened, ribbons curled on the carpet. Jake proudly showed me his new video game. Emma twirled in her new sweater, and I felt, briefly, like I belonged in their world again. Even in the kitchen, Amanda and I managed a fragile dance of cooperation. She basted the turkey while I chopped vegetables, making small talk about the weather and Emma's choir concert. The facade held until dessert. "Margaret," Amanda said as she pulled the turkey from the oven, "could you grab the desserts from the counter?" I turned toward the counter, expecting to see my apple crisp standing proud among the sweets. Instead, pumpkin pie, chocolate cake, and a glossy store-bought tart. But no crisp. My heart thudded. "Where did you put my crisp?" I asked, scanning the counters. Amanda's expression flickered for a fraction of a second before settling back into that hostess mask. Oh, that. I put it in the pantry. We already have so much food. And honestly, Brian mentioned that store-bought is just easier for cleanup. That casual dismissal felt like being erased. I'd been making that crisp for 30 years. It wasn't just a dessert. It was tradition. It was the smell of Christmas mornings when Brian was little, the memory of his sticky fingers stealing bites of crumble before dinner. I swallowed the sting, but couldn't keep the tremor out of my voice. I've been making that recipe since before you were here. It's Jake's favorite. Amanda shrugged, turning back to the turkey. People's tastes change. That should have been the end of it. A wiser woman might have let it slide. Kept the peace. Saved the argument for another day. But there's a certain stubborn streak that comes with age. I once read in a psychology journal that older adults value legacy more than novelty, and it rang true. That crisp wasn't just dessert. It was a thread tying me to my grandchildren's memories. Amanda, I said firmly, I spent 3 hours making that crisp yesterday. The least you could do is serve it. Her mask slipped, just slightly, but enough to reveal the hostility underneath. 3 hours? 3 hours for a dessert nobody even asked for? This is exactly what I mean, Margaret. You just assume your presence. Assume we need your input. Assume we want you here at all. The kitchen went silent, except for the faint bubbling of gravy on the stove. From the living room, I could still hear Brian and the kids laughing, completely unaware that a war front had opened just 10 feet away. I brought dessert because that's what family does. I whispered. Amanda's eyes narrowed. Family doesn't rearrange refrigerators when they're not asked. Family doesn't undermine parenting decisions. And family doesn't demand to be catered to just because they're old. Every word landed like a slap. My mind flipped through the past year, reorganizing groceries to make space, gently suggesting more structure for Jake, giving Emma books for camp. Each well-meaning act twisted into ammunition. I tried to breathe slowly, reminding myself of something my grandmother used to say. Age gives you 2 gifts, patience and perspective. At that moment, though, patience felt like a moth-eaten sweater. Amanda leaned closer, whispering, You try to control us, Margaret, just like you did when Brian was a boy. And now you're doing it to my kids. I wanted to argue, but my throat tightened. The accusation about gifts with strings attached hit hardest because it wasn't true. Yet I couldn't deny the flickers of disappointment I'd felt when my help went unacknowledged. Amanda saw my hesitation and pounced. See, you keep track. You use your generosity like a leash. The turkey sizzled, the gravy bubbled, but I barely noticed. I was realizing something much colder. I hadn't just brought apple crisp into their house. I'd brought decades of history, expectations, and silent sacrifices. And Amanda was determined to snuff them out. The dinner table that evening looked like a postcard. Polished silverware, flickering candles, and plates piled with food so perfect it could have been photographed for a magazine. But under that picture-perfect spread lay a silence thick enough to choke on. Amanda wore her smile like armor. Brian chatted obliviously about office politics, and the kids jabbered about their new gadgets. Me? I sat there with a lump in my throat, tasting nothing but bitterness. Then Emma tilted her head and asked the question that cracked Amanda's act wide open. "Grandma, aren't you going to have any apple crisp?" The innocence in her voice felt like a lifeline tossed across stormy waters. Before I could speak, Amanda jumped in. "Oh, Grandma didn't bring apple crisp this year, honey. But look, your favorite chocolate cake." She said it smoothly, almost rehearsed. Jake squinted. 16-year-olds may roll their eyes at chores, but when they sense injustice, they turn into prosecutors. That's not true. I saw it in the pantry when I grabbed napkins. The one with the crumbly top. Grandma always makes it. Amanda's smile tightened. "That's just leftovers from last week. Nothing special. Can we have some anyway?" Jake pressed, already starting to stand. "Sit down, Jake." Amanda's voice carried a sharpness that made Emma freeze mid-bite. "We're eating what's on the table." The air around us thickened. Brian cleared his throat awkwardly, like he'd stumbled into the middle of a documentary about lionesses guarding their kill. "Everything okay, honey?" "Of course," Amanda replied too brightly. "Just keeping things organized. You know how chaotic Christmas can be." Jake wasn't buying it. "Grandma, you did make it, right? The one with oats on top?" I locked eyes with him. His face was stubborn, his loyalty fierce, and for a second, I wanted to protect him from this war he didn't even realize he was in. But Amanda's gaze bore into me, a silent warning. "Yes, Jake," I admitted. "I made it yesterday." "Then why can't we?" "Because," Amanda cut him off, her voice rising despite her polished exterior. "Sometimes adults decide what's appropriate for special occasions. And sometimes," her eyes bored into me, "traditions don't need to be preserved just because they're old." The words landed harder than she intended, I think. She wasn't talking about dessert anymore. She was talking about me, my role, my very place in this family. I lowered my fork gently. "I see." Amanda's eyes gleamed with quiet victory. She sliced herself a large piece of chocolate cake, announcing, "I'm glad we understand each other." But we didn't. Not at all. Through the rest of dinner, Amanda played perfect hostess, pouring wine and refilling plates, all while shooting me occasional glances that said, "You're finished here." Brian, as usual, floated above the conflict, chatting about his new project at work. Emma showed off her phone case. Jake sulked quietly, and I chewed dutifully, feeling more like a ghost than a grandmother. I should have walked away right then, but instead, I lingered, watching every little gesture, every subtle exclusion. Amanda laughed a little too loudly at Brian's jokes. She brushed off Emma's attempt to pass me a serving dish. She managed, somehow, to make me invisible without ever breaking her smile. Later, when the dessert tray was brought out, Amanda repeated the lie as if it were gospel. "No apple crisp this year, kids. But look at this beautiful chocolate cake." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes flickered with triumph. It struck me then. This wasn't about dessert. It was about erasing me. One tradition at a time, one gathering at a time. until my presence was no longer needed or wanted. I thought of something I'd once read in a sociology textbook. Family dynamics are less about blood and more about power. That line had seemed academic at the time, but here it was, alive at my dinner table. And then, as if the universe couldn't resist a little irony, I remembered a quirky fact about turkeys. Benjamin Franklin once suggested the turkey should be America's national bird instead of the bald eagle. He called it a bird of courage. Sitting there, facing Amanda's carefully orchestrated dismissal, I wondered if Franklin had been onto something. I needed some of that turkey courage, because it was becoming painfully clear that Amanda wasn't just excluding a dessert. She was excluding me. When I think back to that dinner, the word that comes to mind is battlefield. Not in the sense of shouting or plates flying. No, Amanda was far too strategic for that. It was a quiet battlefield, where every smile was a sword, and every polite phrase was dipped in poison. The kids were still buzzing with post-gift excitement. Emma chatting about her choir, Jake half listening while sneaking glances at his new game. Brian tried to keep conversation flowing, like an orchestra conductor determined to ignore the violin string that had just snapped. Meanwhile, I sat in silence, pushing food around my plate, wondering how long Amanda had been rehearsing her lines of dismissal. "Grandma, do you like the potatoes?" Emma asked sweetly, sliding the bowl toward me. I opened my mouth to answer, but Amanda beat me to it. "She's not really eating much tonight, sweetheart. I think she's full already." A small thing, but it was another erasure, subtle enough to look like kindness, sharp enough to feel like a cut. I managed a smile for Emma. "They're delicious, honey." Amanda sipped her wine, watching me over the rim of her glass, like a cat watching a cornered mouse. She didn't need to say anything more. The message was clear. Then Jake, bless his stubborn heart, broke the silence with a jab of truth. "Mom, why can't we have the apple crisp? Grandma made it." Brian looked puzzled, as if only now realizing there had been a dessert dispute. "Apple crisp? Mom, you brought one." "Yes," I said softly. "It's in the pantry." Amanda let out a laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "We've been over this. It wasn't right for tonight. Honestly, Margaret, I don't know why you're making such a big deal about dessert." Brian chuckled nervously, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, maybe we can have it later as a midnight snack." There it was, the diplomatic move. My son, who used to charge headfirst into problems as a boy, now choosing detours instead of direct roads. He'd become an expert at navigating Amanda's moods, like a sailor steering around hidden reefs. I thought about an old saying, "Silence can be louder than shouting." It was certainly true here. Brian's refusal to confront Amanda directly screamed volumes. He didn't want conflict. He didn't want to see what was happening. Jake muttered, "Midnight snack, huh?" and stabbed his fork into his potatoes. Emma fiddled with her napkin, too young to grasp the full tension, but old enough to sense it. The rest of the meal passed like a funeral procession. Plates clinked, forks scraped, but the warmth of the holiday had evaporated. Amanda laughed at something Brian said, a brittle sound that fooled no one. When the dishes were cleared, I offered to help, partly out of habit, partly out of a desperate need for a private word with Brian. But Amanda orchestrated the cleanup like a general assigning troops. Brian was sent to the garage with Jake for a project. Emma was dispatched upstairs to organize her new clothes. And suddenly, it was just Amanda and me in the kitchen, exactly how she wanted it. The counters were lined with dirty dishes, but the real mess was between us. Amanda scraped plates with unnecessary force and said without looking up, "I suppose you're proud of yourself." I set down the bowl I was rinsing. "I'm not sure what you mean." The little scene at dinner, making me look bad in front of the kids. Very mature, Margaret. There was no point pretending anymore. Her words had stripped the veneer clean off. "Amanda, I need to understand something. Why does it feel like you're trying to erase me from this family?" She turned then, eyes blazing, mask gone. "Because you don't belong here. This is my family, my home, my children. Brian is my husband, not your little boy anymore. You don't get to insert yourself into our lives whenever you feel lonely." The words hit like a slap, but I held her gaze. Brian is still my son. Those children are still my grandchildren. Amanda's laugh was sharp, humorless. "They're mine, Margaret, not yours. And I decide what kind of family we are." The possessiveness in her tone was chilling. It reminded me of something I'd once read in a psychology article. Some people treat relationships as ownership, not partnership. In that moment, Amanda sounded less like a wife and mother and more like a gatekeeper, determined to control who was allowed inside the walls of her castle. The kitchen light flickered slightly, the hum of the dishwasher filling the silence. I realized then that Amanda wasn't just irritated with me. She saw me as a threat to her power, and she was willing to rewrite every family memory to push me out. A strange calm settled over me. I'd heard once that during conflict, older adults often regulate emotions better than the young. Maybe it was experience. Maybe it was simply exhaustion. But instead of shouting, I just said quietly, "You can't erase me, Amanda. Not completely." Her smile was icy. "Watch me." After everyone had gone back to their corners, Brian tinkering in the garage, Emma upstairs folding clothes, Jake pretending not to sulk, I stayed in the kitchen with Amanda. The smell of roasted turkey still lingered, but the warmth of the day had been sucked out like air from a punctured balloon. Amanda leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me as though she were a queen passing judgment on a trespasser. "You know what your problem is, Margaret?" she asked, scraping gravy from a serving bowl with deliberate force. "You think your love makes you indispensable, but all it really does is make you a nuisance." Her words were cold, but her tone was casual, almost clinical. She was dissecting me like a specimen on a tray. "I give because I care," I said carefully, my hands trembling as I stacked plates. "Family is supposed to help each other. You mean control each other." Amanda's lips curled. "You give money, you give gifts, but what you're really buying is influence. Admit it." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the truth snagged in my throat. There had been times when I reminded Brian of the braces I paid for, or the mortgage payment I covered when he was between jobs. I never meant them as guilt trips, more like shared history. But Amanda had twisted them into chains. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Do you know what Brian says when you leave? He says you exhaust him. He says you smother us. And honestly, he's right. You hover like a helicopter, and then you pout when we don't let you land. I felt my chest tighten, as though every one of her words had weight. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then slowly, I placed the plate in the sink and steadied myself. You don't get to rewrite my love for my son as manipulation, I said. My voice was calm, but inside, I was shaking. I have always wanted what's best for him. Amanda rolled her eyes. What's best for him is me. I'm the wife, the mother of his children, the center of this household. And you're just an old woman with a checkbook and too much free time. It was meant to be a killing blow. And for a moment, it almost was. I thought of my small apartment, my long evenings alone, with nothing but tea and the TV. I thought of how many times I'd sat by the phone, waiting for Brian to call. The picture she painted of me wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I remembered something my own mother once told me. People will use your sacrifices against you if you let them. That's why you give with open hands, not with strings. At the time, I thought she meant not to expect repayment, but maybe she'd meant not to let anyone weaponize your generosity. I straightened my back. If that's how you see me, Amanda, then maybe it's time I stopped giving altogether. For the first time, she faltered. Her eyes flickered, uncertainty slipping through the cracks. That's not what Isn't it? I pressed. You've made it very clear. My place in this family is purely financial. You tolerate me because I write checks. Fine. Let's treat it like the business transaction you want it to be. No more gifts, no more loans, no more strings, as you call them. Just nothing. Her face paled, but she quickly masked it with anger. You're being ridiculous. We never asked for... Yes, you did. Maybe not in words, but every time you took my money with a tight smile, every time you pretended it didn't come with sacrifice on my part, you were asking. Amanda's jaw tightened. So what? You're cutting us off now? You think that makes you the bigger person? No, I said quietly. It makes me free. The kitchen filled with silence, heavier than any argument. Amanda turned back to the sink, scrubbing a plate so hard it squeaked against the porcelain. Her shoulders were rigid, her movements sharp. I knew I'd struck something deep. And strangely, instead of fear, I felt clarity, a peculiar lightness, as though the fog of years had lifted. For too long, I'd mistaken tolerance for affection, obligation for love. Tonight, Amanda had handed me the truth, like a poisoned gift. But truth, even poisoned, was still truth. I thought about a quirky fact I'd once read. In ancient Rome, salt was so valuable, it was used as currency. That's where the word salary comes from. Love, I realized, had been my family's salt, and I'd been spending it like coin, hoping it would buy closeness. But Amanda had revealed the cost, dignity, and that was one expense I could no longer afford. When I finally left their house that night, clutching my untouched apple crisp like a relic of a lost battle, I felt hollow. The air outside was crisp, the sky pricked with stars, but I barely noticed. Brian walked me to the door, his voice gentle but detached, like he was speaking to a neighbor instead of his mother. "Mom, are you sure you want to head home already? It's still early." I forced a smile. "I'm just tired, sweetheart. Thank you for everything." He looked at me curiously, as though trying to read between the lines. But whatever questions he had, he didn't ask. He hugged me, kissed my cheek, and returned to his warm house, the one where I had just learned I wasn't truly welcome. On the drive home, I took the long way through neighborhoods, glowing with Christmas lights. Families gathered around tables, kids chased each other in yards. Shadows of warmth flickered behind curtains. I wondered how many of those houses hid dysfunction. Like mine, how many grandmothers sat quietly, realizing their place had been erased. Back in my small apartment, I set the apple crisp on the counter. I didn't touch it. Instead, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper. Not a grocery list this time. Not even New Year's resolutions. It was a reckoning. I wrote down every loan I'd given Brian and Amanda over the past 5 years. Mortgage payments, car repairs, summer camp for Emma, braces for Jake, gift cards that mysteriously ended up in Amanda's purse. By the time I totaled it, the number stared back at me like a cruel joke. $43,000. More than I could truly afford, especially on a fixed retirement income. But money wasn't the real issue. The real issue was respect, or rather the absence of it. I remembered Amanda's words in the kitchen. "You're just an old woman with a checkbook." That phrase burrowed into me like a splinter, and yet there was truth in it. I had been buying my place at the table. I had convinced myself that financial support equaled love, but tolerance is not love. Obligation is not respect. It reminded me of something I once read in a dusty philosophy book. True generosity is giving without needing gratitude, but true dignity is knowing when to stop giving to those who only take. I'd blurred that line for too long. My phone buzzed. Brian's name lit the screen. I ignored it. He called again, and again. On the third ring, I answered. "Mom, thank God. Listen, there's been a situation here." His voice trembled. "Amanda called the police. She says you threatened her." The teacup in my hand rattled. "What?" "She told them you said you were cutting off contact with the family and that she feels unsafe. The officers are here now. They want to talk to you." For a moment, the world tilted sideways. After everything, her insults, her lies, her erasure, Amanda had now painted herself as the victim, and me, the villain. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my living room across from Officer Patricia Wells, a woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and the calm of someone who'd seen every family feud imaginable. "Mrs. Foster," she began, flipping open her notebook, "your daughter-in-law claims you made threatening statements and behaved erratically. Can you tell me your version of what happened?" I almost laughed, the absurdity so bitter it burned. "Officer, Amanda told me tonight that my role in the family is purely financial, that they tolerate me for my money. I told her I understood and would adjust my expectations. No more pretending we're one big happy family. If they need help, they can ask. But I won't keep enabling resentment. That's it." Officer Wells raised an eyebrow. What kind of financial help are we talking about? I handed her the list I'd made. $43,000 over 5 years. Mortgage payments, medical bills, camps, car repairs. I've never asked for repayment. She let out a low whistle. That's substantial. And you've never threatened to withhold unless they... No. I told her we should treat it like business, since she made it clear love wasn't part of the bargain anymore. She studied me for a long moment. That doesn't sound like a threat to me. It sounds like boundaries. I nodded, though my hands still shook. Amanda doesn't want boundaries. She wants control. When the officer finally left, promising to note no evidence of threatening behavior, I sat in the quiet and realized something profound. I wasn't broken. I wasn't even devastated. I was angry, cleanly, righteously angry. For the first time in years, that anger felt like fuel instead of poison. Amanda had overplayed her hand. She had called the police to shame me, to frighten me back into compliance. Instead, she had handed me the truth on a silver platter. That night, I told myself something I hadn't dared whisper before. It ends here. No more victim, no more tolerance bought with checks, no more letting Amanda define who I am. And for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. The next morning, sunlight leaked through the blinds of my small apartment, catching the rim of my abandoned apple crisp dish. I stared at it for a long time before deciding not to throw it away. Strange, isn't it? How one dessert can become a symbol. To Amanda, it was an inconvenience. To me, it was proof that my history mattered, that my recipes, my effort, my existence mattered. I poured myself coffee and tried to shake the image of Officer Wells jotting notes in her little black pad. No evidence of threatening behavior, she had said. Those words echoed like a stamp of validation. For once, I wasn't the one apologizing. But Amanda wasn't finished. Brian called later that afternoon. His voice was hushed, as though he was speaking from a closet. "Mom, listen. Amanda's still upset. She thinks you overreacted, and she wants me to smooth things over. Can we talk tomorrow?" I almost laughed. Smooth things over. As if Amanda had merely spilled red wine on the carpet instead of calling the police on me. "Brian," I said gently, "do you think I threatened your wife?" Silence stretched on the line. I could hear him breathing, hear the faint sound of a television in the background. "No, Mom," he finally admitted, "but Amanda feels." Stop right there. Feelings don't rewrite facts. She twisted what I said because it served her. Another silence. Then he sighed. "Let's just talk tomorrow." I hung up, my hand trembling. He couldn't, or wouldn't, see it. He'd grown so used to Amanda's reality distortion that he accepted it like air. That evening, my thoughts drifted back to Amanda's past, the blank spaces in her story, where she'd worked before meeting Brian, what her maiden name really was. I realized I knew nothing concrete, and that bothered me more than it should have. So, I did what any stubborn grandmother with Wi-Fi and a healthy dose of suspicion would do. I started digging. Amanda Mitchell. That was the name she'd carried before Foster. A common enough name. But when I paired it with Denver, with employment records, With court databases, things began to pop up. 3 Amanda Mitchells had appeared in civil suits between 2010 and 2015. 2 were clearly wrong. Different ages, different appearances. But the third one, Amanda J. Mitchell, age 28 in 2014, accused of embezzlement by her former employer. The case had been settled out of court, but the initial filings were still visible. 8 months of systematically siphoning money, disguised through clever bookkeeping. My blood ran cold. The timeline fit too neatly. Case settled in early 2015. Brian met Amanda later that same year at a coffee shop she managed. A woman with a fresh stain on her record, looking for a new start, maybe even a new identity. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. Suddenly, her obsession with controlling the household finances made more sense. Her skill at manipulation wasn't just personal, it was professional. And then, because the universe has impeccable timing, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. "Mrs. Foster?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Detective Sarah Reeves, Denver Police Financial Crimes Unit. I understand you've been looking up records on Amanda Mitchell. Could we ask why?" The room tilted. "Excuse me, how do you—" "Ma'am, certain searches trigger alerts in our system. Amanda Mitchell is a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. We need to know your connection to her." I gripped the edge of the table. "She's my daughter-in-law, Amanda Foster now, married to my son in 2016. There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you the ground beneath your feet is about to shift. "Mrs. Foster, would you be willing to come in tomorrow morning? There are things you need to know about Amanda Mitchell, and things we need to know about you." I ended the call and sat in silence. The steam from my coffee had long since faded, leaving the cup lukewarm. Amanda wasn't just difficult. She wasn't just manipulative. She might actually be dangerous. It reminded me of a line I once read in a criminology book. Something dry and academic. Patterns of deception in financial fraud. Mirror patterns in abusive relationships. Secrecy, isolation, and control. I hadn't thought much of it then. Now, it felt like the author had been describing Amanda directly. Later, as I tried to fall asleep, I remembered a quirky fact I'd once told Emma for a school project. Octopuses have 3 hearts, but when they swim, one of them stops beating. I couldn't help but smile grimly. Amanda, too, seemed to function with selective hearts. She gave affection when it benefited her, stopped cold when it didn't. That night, I barely slept. Tomorrow, I'd learn just how deep Amanda's deceptions went. The next morning, I drove downtown through streets still dusted with last night's snow. The city quiet in that post-holiday lull. At precisely 9:00 a.m., I sat across from Detective Sarah Reeves in a cramped office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. A manila folder sat on her desk, thick with documents, Amanda's photo clipped to the front like a scarlet flag. "Mrs. Foster," Detective Reeves began, "Amanda Mitchell has been using multiple identities for more than a decade. The embezzlement case you found, that was only the tip of the iceberg." My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" She opened the folder. Surveillance photos, court records, financial statements. Each page another nail in the coffin of the woman I thought I knew. She's been married twice before, under different names. In both cases, she drained her husband's finances and vanished. She's repeated this pattern in different states. We believe your son is her latest target. I gripped the edge of the chair. What about the children? Jake and Emma. The detective's tone softened. Our investigation suggests they're biologically your sons. She won't abandon them in the same way. But she has no hesitation abandoning him once she's extracted what she can. The words sat heavy in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My grandchildren were safe, thank God. But Brian, he was a mark. Detective Reeves slid another photo across the desk. Amanda, stepping into a storage unit, boxes piled in her arms. Another showed her at a bank with a man I didn't recognize. We believe she's preparing to disappear again, the detective said. The room felt suddenly colder. My daughter-in-law wasn't just cruel. She was running a long con, and we were all pawns. What do you need from me? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Reeves leaned forward. We need your cooperation. Amanda trusts you enough to talk about money. If you make an offer she can't refuse, she'll reveal her hidden accounts. That's the evidence we need to move forward. I hesitated. You want me to bait her? Yes, Reeves said simply. We call it a controlled operation. You'd present her with an inheritance gift, something substantial enough to trigger her greed. She'll try to steer the funds into accounts we don't know about. That's when we'll have her. It sounded like something out of a TV drama, but this was my life. I thought of Amanda's eyes, across the dinner table, cold and gleaming, telling me my traditions didn't matter because they were old. I thought of her calling the police to humiliate me, then twisting the narrative to make herself the victim. And I thought of Brian, still clinging to her version of reality, too blind to see the truth. All right, I said finally. I'll do it. Reeves nodded. We'll set it up for later this week. We'll be nearby the entire time. You won't be alone. On the drive home, my mind buzzed. Amanda's control suddenly looked less like insecurity and more like strategy. Her hostility toward me wasn't random. It was calculated. If she could erase me, the one person who might question her motives, she could isolate Brian completely. At home, I brewed tea and pulled out my notebook again. This time, I wasn't writing a list of money given. I was writing questions. How much had Amanda funneled into hidden accounts? How long had she been preparing to leave? Was Brian even aware of their financial state? Or had she spun him into ignorance? For once, my anger felt purposeful. Later that afternoon, I drove past Brian's house, parking across the street. I told myself I wasn't spying, just observing. At 2:30, a delivery truck arrived. Not UPS or FedEx, a boutique furniture store, the kind that sells tables costing more than most cars. Two men unloaded a gleaming dining set, carried it through the front door. Half an hour later, Amanda's SUV pulled up. She stepped out with shopping bags from Nordstrom, Anthropologie, and 3 other high-end stores. Her phone pressed to her ear. Her laughter rang out across the quiet street. The picture was clear. Less than 24 hours after telling me they were under crushing financial pressure, she was indulging in a shopping spree. My phone rang. Brian again, Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mom," he said, "about yesterday. Amanda feels terrible." "Does she?" I asked coolly, watching her carry bags inside. "Yes. She wants us to move past it. But I need to ask, how much money do you think you've given us over the years?" The question stopped me cold. "Why are you asking?" "Because Amanda thinks it's not as much as you claim." I took a deep breath. $67,000, Brian. That's the real number. I have bank records, canceled checks, everything. The line went silent. Finally, he whispered, "That can't be right." "It is." I watched Amanda disappear inside with her designer bags. "And maybe you should start asking where it's all gone." I hung up before he could respond. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind flicked between memories. Amanda's smile, the lies at dinner, the police at my door, and now the knowledge that this wasn't just family drama. It was a criminal pattern. I thought about something quirky I'd once read in a science magazine. Sharks can sense a drop of blood in the ocean from miles away. Amanda had that same predatory instinct. She smelled weakness, and she circled until she struck. But this time she'd circled too close. Friday morning, I sat in my car outside a coffee shop downtown, palms sweaty despite the cold. Detective Reeves's voice echoed in my head. "Just be natural. Don't overplay it. Amanda will do the rest." Amanda arrived right on time. Striding across the parking lot in a camel-colored coat and heels, far too high for icy pavement. She spotted me, plastered on her hostess smile, and slid into the chair across from me. "Margaret," she said warmly, as though Christmas hadn't ended with a police visit. "This is a surprise." I forced a smile of my own. I wanted to talk, clear the air. Her eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. She wasn't buying the peace offering act, but she was intrigued. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Amanda, I've been thinking about what you said at Christmas, about boundaries, about not assuming I belong in every part of your lives." She tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "I appreciate you hearing me. I do. And I want to make things easier for everyone. I've decided to give Brian and the kids a substantial early inheritance, $200,000. That way, your family can have security without me hovering." Her mask cracked. For a split second, greed flashed in her eyes like lightning. She covered it quickly with a polite nod. "That's incredibly generous, but such a large sum comes with complications. You know, taxes, accounts, all that." "I assumed as much," I said. "That's why I'll need information about all your accounts. Joint, personal, investment, anything that could be used to receive the funds. My advisor will need verification of balances for tax purposes." Amanda didn't hesitate. "Of course. I manage everything anyway. Brian's so busy with work, it's better if we just handle this between us. Hook, line, sinker." Over the next 20 minutes, she rattled off account numbers, routing details, even mentioned a consulting business she supposedly ran. 3 accounts under names I'd never heard before. Every word recorded, every detail logged by Reeves's team at the back of the cafe. By the time we finished, Amanda reached across the table and touched my hand. Margaret, I think we got off on the wrong foot at Christmas. This is a fresh start. I smiled faintly. Yes, a fresh start. As soon as she walked out, Detective Reeves slipped into the seat Amanda had just vacated. We've got her, she whispered. 3 of those accounts are false identities. Tomorrow morning, we move. That night, sleep was impossible. I paced my apartment, the weight of the truth pressing down. Amanda wasn't just manipulative. She was dangerous, practiced, and calculating. She had married my son not out of love, but out of strategy. Still, doubt gnawed at me. Would Brian ever forgive me for being part of the sting? Would the children understand? Or would they only see their grandmother as the one who tore their mother away? I poured tea and stared at the apple crisp still sitting in my fridge. Funny how that one dish had been the first domino in a cascade that revealed everything. Around midnight, I remembered a strange fact Emma once told me for a science project. Starfish can survive losing a limb, even regrow it. That's how I felt now. A piece of me had been cut off, but maybe, just maybe, I could grow something new in its place. The next morning, my phone rang. Brian's voice was shaky, panicked. Mom, Amanda's been arrested. They're saying fraud, false identities, even prior marriages. She's not who we thought she was. I closed my eyes. Relief, sorrow, vindication, they all tangled together in my chest. The detective had been right. Amanda had revealed herself the moment greed dangled before her. And now, finally, the truth was no longer mine, alone to carry. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. When Brian called me that morning, his voice sounded like a man whose world had just crumbled. Mom, she's gone. They took her away in handcuffs. I don't even know who I married. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, listening to the raw panic in his tone. Part of me wanted to soothe him, to remind him of the strength he still had. Another part of me wanted to shake him, to demand how he could have been so blind. Brian, I said softly, you love the person you thought she was. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human, he sniffed. But what about the kids? Emma keeps asking where Mom is. Jake's angry. He slammed his door and hasn't come out. They'll need time, I told him. But they still have you, and they still have me. Silence stretched across the line, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, he whispered, How did you know, Mom? How did you see what I couldn't? I let out a long breath. Because I've lived long enough to know that when someone constantly rewrites history, it's not forgetfulness, it's strategy. Amanda wasn't just difficult, Brian. She was calculated. That afternoon, Detective Reeves called to update me. Amanda had been charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and financial manipulation across 3 states. She would not be coming home anytime soon. You did well, Reeves told me. Without your cooperation, we wouldn't have had enough to move so quickly. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the apple crisp I'd finally reheated. This time, I ate it slowly, savoring every bite. The taste was bittersweet, but it was mine, untainted, unchallenged. Later that week, Brian brought the kids to visit me. Emma hugged me so tight I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. Jake muttered, "Guess you were right about Mom," his teenage bravado crumbling at the edges. I didn't gloat. Instead, I pulled them close and whispered, "We're going to be okay. Families bend. Sometimes they even break. But we can build something stronger." That night, after they left, I thought about how close I had come to losing them all, to being erased completely. Amanda had nearly succeeded in her campaign, but instead, her greed had exposed her. I remembered something I once read in a dusty old philosophy book. Truth, like oil, rises to the surface no matter how deeply it's buried. Amanda had buried hers under layers of charm and manipulation. But in the end, it bubbled up. And then, because my mind tends to wander when the house is quiet, I thought about a quirky fact I'd once heard on a trivia show. Lobsters don't technically age the way we do. They keep growing, shedding, renewing. Maybe that was the lesson here. I was 67, yes. But like those lobsters, I could still shed an old shell and grow a new one. For years, I had let Amanda define me as a nuisance, as an obligation, as a woman whose only value was a checkbook. Now, I had reclaimed my dignity. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't see a victim. I saw a survivor, a grandmother, a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. Brian would need time. The kids would need reassurance. But me, I already knew the path forward, because sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or even fighting. It's simply refusing to be erased. The weeks that followed Amanda's arrest blurred together in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and difficult conversations. Brian visited often, sometimes with the kids, sometimes alone, always looking worn down, as though a decade of blind trust had suddenly aged him overnight. He'd sit at my kitchen table, fingers laced together, staring into his coffee without drinking it. "Mom," he said one evening, "I don't know how to tell the kids everything. How do I explain that their mother isn't who we thought she was?" I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You tell them the truth, Brian. Not all at once, not with anger, but with honesty. They deserve that much, and they deserve a father who doesn't run from reality." His eyes filled, and for a moment he was my little boy again, the one who used to climb into my lap after a nightmare, clutching his blanket. Except now, the nightmare was real, and I couldn't chase it away with warm milk. Jake coped by shutting himself in his room with his video games. But one afternoon, when he came over to my apartment, he muttered, "Grandma, I knew something was off. Mom always cared more about stuff than us." His voice cracked, and I pulled him into a hug he pretended to resist. "Emma, sweet Emma," cried openly. "Did she ever love us, Grandma?" That question cut deeper than any insult Amanda had ever thrown. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "She loved you in her way, honey. But you don't need to question if you're loved. Not while I'm here." Life slowly began to shift. Without Amanda's controlling presence, Brian seemed freer, lighter, though grief still clung to him. The children leaned on me more, coming over for dinners, even helping me decorate my tiny apartment with leftover ornaments from Christmas. One evening, as Emma stirred cocoa on my stove, Jake asked, "Grandma, can we have your apple crisp again?" I laughed, the sound surprising me. "Of course. From now on, it's always on the table." And as I slid the dish into the oven, the smell of cinnamon and apples filling my small kitchen, I realized how symbolic that was. Something Amanda had tried to bury in the pantry had become the centerpiece again. Not just dessert, but tradition, memory, connection. I also realized something else. I'd been complicit in Amanda's control by confusing generosity with belonging. I had blurred love and obligation until they became the same language. But now, with clarity, I could rewrite my role, not as financier, not as unwanted guest, but as grandmother, as mother, as Maggie. A few weeks later, Detective Reeves called with an update. Amanda had entered a plea deal, facing years behind bars. Her history of fraud across multiple states was finally catching up with her. When I hung up, I brewed tea and sat quietly by the window, watching snow fall in lazy spirals. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for a call, waiting for approval, waiting for inclusion. I was simply present. It struck me how much of life I had spent bargaining for acceptance, and how liberating it felt to stop. I remembered something I once read in a gerontology article. Aging isn't just about decline, it's about distillation, the stripping away of what doesn't matter until what remains is pure. That's what had happened here. Painful as it was, Amanda had stripped away illusions and left me with truth. And a quirky fact floated into my mind. One I'd once told the kids to make them laugh. Parrots can live over 80 years, outlasting generations of families. Maybe the lesson was that survival isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's just about staying long enough to see the truth unfold. On a quiet Sunday, I baked another apple crisp, setting it carefully on the table as Brian and the kids arrived. They dug in with laughter, the sound ringing through my apartment like a hymn. For once, there were no undercurrents, no silent erasures, just family. At 67, I had learned something priceless. Dignity is not negotiable, and sometimes the bravest act isn't fighting louder. It's walking away until you're ready to stand taller. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and share your own story in the comments. Your voice matters. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. It's a long one, I know, but some truths can't be told quickly. Over the course of one holiday season, I went from being silenced at a dinner table to finding my voice again. What started as a fight over apple crisp turned out to be something far darker. A revelation about manipulation, about greed, and about the quiet ways someone can try to erase you from your own family. Amanda's downfall wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply the inevitable unraveling of lies. Her pattern of control, her rewriting of traditions, her use of generosity as leverage, all of it collapsed the moment she was forced to face outside scrutiny. That's the thing about deception. It thrives in the shadows, but it withers under light. For me, the greatest lesson wasn't about Amanda at all. It was about myself. I learned that I had been complicit in my own erasure by confusing tolerance for love and obligation for respect. Once I let go of that illusion, I found strength I didn't know I still had. The children will heal, Brian will rebuild, and me, I'll keep making apple crisp, not as a bargaining chip, but as a gift freely given, with no strings attached. So if you take anything from this story, let it be this: you are never too old to reclaim your dignity, never too late to draw boundaries, never too late to stop being someone's victim. Now, take a deep breath, turn down the lights, maybe pour yourself a cup of tea, and know that no matter what storms rage around you, you are not alone in them.